The snap of my grandson's badge under the acrylic hit like a gavel, and the librarian, chin lifted, cardigan buttoned to the throat, let the word procedure cut the air while the line behind us stiffened. Fluorescent lights buzzing like trapped insects, lemon-polished counter gleaming, my blue folder open like a small courtroom, entry log stamped, teacher's authorization signed, while Caleb's shoulders folded in that quiet way kids learn when the world decides their names are smaller than a rule no one will read aloud. I watched her eyes skim past his face as if he were a smudge on glass, the attendant screen washing him in cold blue, the room dividing itself, those who look away, those who pretend not to see, while paper dust and toner hung like a thin fog, and I felt the old grit rise in my hands, the same steadiness that carried freight and families and Sunday chairs, and I promised the lens and the room this: before the clock coughs out another minute, I will pull the policy from the shadows, stitch log to signature, and make this counter say his name back out loud when the turn you don't see coming finally lands. Before I go on, hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If this speaks to you, share it. Awareness protects our elders. The humiliation landed before I could steady my breath. The librarian pinched my grandson's badge with 2 fingers, slipped it behind the acrylic lip of the checkout counter, and said the words that flatten a room: internal procedure, pending review. The click of plastic against plastic carried farther than it should have, sharp as a jar lid sealed at the wrong moment. The line behind us tightened, shoes scuffed the carpet. The clock above the return slot lagged a second behind reality. The air smelled like paper dust, lemon cleaner, and the faint tang of hand sanitizer. I felt the blood travel from my throat to my hands and settle there, heavy, as if I was still carrying sacks from another life. I placed my blue folder on the counter as someone places a level on a porch step, aligning something small so bigger things don't tilt later. The folder had weight because of what it held: my grandson's entry log with the exact hour and signature, the authorization from his teacher, the study plan for the afternoon, and the schedule I had drafted for a listening circle that didn't erase anyone. The folder's hinge creaked when it opened, a soft old sound against all that new plastic and glowing screens. I could feel the heat from the checkout terminal on my forearm, a little fan pushing warm air into the cold of the library. Behind the acrylic, the badge sat like a coin trapped beneath glass. The librarian did not look cruel, she looked certain. Her hair was pinned back tight, her cardigan buttoned to the top, her eyes fixed on a rule I could not see. Next to her, an attendant pressed keys, face lit by the monitor's flat blue. He had the measured patience of someone timing a recipe. He typed in my grandson's ID number and waited for the system to deliver a reason. The silence thickened, not dramatic, just institutional. The kind that smells like toner and repeats itself in the same tone day after day. My grandson stood close enough that his sleeve brushed mine. Caleb is careful by nature. He watches screens with the same attention he gives to birds on a wire. I felt that attention now like a steadying hand I couldn't show I needed. I named what we had, not as a challenge, but as a map. Entry logged at the door. Check. Teacher authorization. Check. Reading list for the week. Check. Study plan. Check. The librarian repeated the phrase internal procedure as if it were a key someone else had, and the attendant read from a line on the screen that left out verbs, as if verbs made trouble. Behind us, the line broke into 2 groups: those who pretended they couldn't hear, and those who heard everything and tried not to see. I could hear a stapler snap from somewhere deeper in the stacks. Somewhere a cart's wheels vibrated over a seam in the floor. Somewhere a printer sang 3 notes and went quiet.
I had brought more than papers. I had brought a way forward. In the blue folder, a single page held the outline of our listening circle for this week. A simple structure for speaking and hearing, for recognizing what came before and who is here now. The city was chewing over itself again, 2 names for one day tugging at old scenes. I was not there to referee history with a whisper. I was there to help my grandson study in a room where books outweighed rumors. But that badge, trapped under acrylic, turned the air to glass. The librarian's expression did not move. The attendant's fingers hovered over a key labeled "Override" he hadn't been told to touch. I asked to see the written policy. The words came out steady. Not loud, not small. The kind you use when you need the room itself to become a witness. Procedures gain power from paper. If a rule exists, it lives somewhere with a section number and a sentence that can be read. The librarian's lips pressed, then parted just enough to say that the policy existed behind the desk, in the binder with tabs, and that until the system cleared the badge, no materials could be borrowed, no study room reserved, nothing issued in my grandson's name. I heard my own pulse, like footsteps going upstairs. Caleb angled his phone so I could see the timestamp from the entry scanner, the quiet confirmation captured as a tiny green check an hour earlier. He didn't say a word, but it was all there. Time of arrival, door number, the first ping of the day that said his badge had worked to get in, and then something else, a second ping that looked like a note added after the fact. He showed it to me without lifting it higher than our wrists, like a bird he didn't want to startle. The attendant noticed the movement and shifted his weight, because nothing private stays private when a cue wraps around a corner. I thought of my wife the way I always do when the air goes thin. She didn't like grand gestures unless they were balloons for a child. She trusted forms filled neatly, receipts kept flat, rules printed in a font you could see without squinting. She used to say the right word can open a stuck door if you hold it steady enough. The blue folder was my steady hand. I opened it to the page labeled Policy Reference and placed it at the top of the stack, paper against acrylic, so the reflection of the fluorescent lights drew straight lines through it, like underlines. The attendant's screen flashed a soft amber icon that meant the system wanted to be asked permission. He leaned closer, the glow turning his jaw a pale lake color. The librarian reached for a small bell but didn't ring it. She pressed a gray button under the desk that sent a dry click into the counter, and I heard the ghost of that sound travel through the laminate. The PA system crackled, and a name was called, with its syllables clipped short. The supervisor was on his way. I focused on small things to keep the room from shrinking. The way the laminate's fake wood grain ran the wrong direction, the triangular scuff on the baseboard, the way the acrylic's bottom edge had collected a tiny ribbon of dust where the rag never quite reached. The line restarted behind us like traffic after a light turns green. People passed around the obstruction we had become. A girl returned a book by letting it slide into the mouth of the slot, and the thump sounded final, even for a paperback. A custodian pushed a mop bucket along the far wall, the water sloshing in a familiar beat, bleach folded into its tide. The smell mixed with the lemon cleaner into something that didn't feel like home or danger, just maintenance. My grandson's breathing stayed even. He does that when something wants to knock him off balance. He lets the moment spend itself while he saves his steps. The librarian asked us to step to the side while the system finished its check. She gestured toward a small table with 2 rigid chairs.
the kind torn from a classroom decades ago and placed in a library so students would not sink. I kept my hands on the blue folder. When I lifted it, the burnished corner left a faint angle in the dust line. The badge stayed where it was, under the acrylic, the photo brown with the light, and the text a shade of gray borrowed from a copy machine. It looked like a portrait held in a drawer.
We moved to the side table and sat. The tabletop was clean enough to reflect the fluorescent rows, white bars bending where the surface had bowed a low under years of elbows. The air vent above us hummed a constant low note. A scuffed monitor on an arm faced the corridor at a careful angle, not quite hidden, not quite public. The attendant followed with the binder, a thick thing with colored tabs, and laid it next to the keyboard, the thud of its spine heavier than I expected. The librarian returned to the counter, where she rolled the acrylic divider a few inches along its track, and then back again, a nervous habit that made a small plastic whisper. I arranged the folder's contents into a sequence that could not be misunderstood. Entry log on top, authorization next, reading list, study plan, and at the bottom the one-page outline of a listening circle that could hold two kinds of memory without bargaining away either. Caleb watched with that quiet attention of his, the kind that makes small proofs big enough to see. He swiped his screen to zoom on the door log, and I felt it like a candle brought close in a room where the switch refuses to work. I knew this wasn't about the whole city or all its names, at least not yet. It was about whether a documented access could be undone by a word no one would print. The supervisor appeared with a walk that had the shape of a decision already forming. His badge swung on a lanyard and tapped his chest every few steps. He wore the neutral expression of a person trying to enter a problem sideways. He scanned our table, let his gaze hold on the blue folder for a breath, and then tilted toward the counter where my grandson's badge still waited under acrylic. The attendant pointed to the screen, where the amber icon blinked like a turn signal waiting for consent. The supervisor touched the mouse, his ring making a light sound against the desk, and a new window opened with a column that listed times, stations, and users. The columns marched down the screen in careful rows: entry time, station number, user code. The entry time was right. The station was the door. The user was the system. Then another line, a later time, the station labeled checkout, and a user code that matched the badge of someone standing within 10 feet of us. He leaned closer, mouth tightening, and pressed print. The printer woke with a humid sigh and a whir, then clicked as if clearing its throat. A sheet began to crawl out, its edge trembling. The ink landed itself down in neat black ladders. At the bottom of the screen, a small note appeared in gray. Override applied. The cursor blinked next to the user code like a fingertip waiting to point. Before I could slide the policy reference fully into his line of sight, he asked us to relocate to the side table for a formal review, while the badge remained under the acrylic. The side table had the sting of disinfectant and the shine of too much light. The surface flexed a little under my forearms, like an old drum stretched one time too many. I set the blue folder in the center and felt the small burr in its cardboard edge catch my fingertip. The hum of the ceiling vent traced the thin line above us. I pulled out the entry log, the teacher's authorization, the reading list, the study plan, and at the bottom, the one-page outline of a listening circle that could hold two kinds of memory without bargaining away either. Caleb watched with that quiet attention of his, the kind that makes small proofs big enough to see. He swiped his screen to zoom on the door log, and I felt it like a candle brought close in a room where the switch refuses to work. I knew this wasn't about the whole city or all its names, at least not yet. It was about whether a documented access could be undone by a word no one would print. The supervisor slid into the rigid chair opposite, the binder of policies thick as a brick between us. His lanyard clicked softly as it settled. He didn't say much, just angled the monitor so the corridor's light fell across it and the glare thinned. Pixels sharpened.
The software's blue-gray frame wrapped a white field that looked harmless until it spoke. The librarian remained at the counter in my peripheral vision, one hand resting near the acrylic divider, like a guard on a gate that didn't belong to her. The attendant hovered between the screen and the binder, tongue pressing briefly to the corner of his mouth when he read.
I breathed through the smell of lemon cleaner and paper dust. I could taste the bitter rim of the sanitizer as it floated back down. Caleb sat to my right, close enough that his knee brushed the table leg. He opened the notes app on his phone and labeled a new page with the time we were asked to move. He did not posture himself as anything except present. It helped. It reminded me that we were not a story about to be decided by rumor. We were a record. The supervisor tapped a key and brought up the badge record. The line with the entry time matched our sheet to the minute. Door station, green check. Then the second line, later, checkout station, amber icon. The words next to it were sterile, pending. No link to a cause, no drop-down checked, just a shape of refusal that looked official because it had been typed. I felt the chair press into my back like a dull hand. I put the entry log on top of the stack. The paper carried the scratch of the pen, a human sound captured in a line of ink. The authorization from the teacher sat next, with a signature that curved upward at the tail, a hopeful slant. The reading list rested flat. The study plan waited. The outline for the listening circle lay face up, the heading simple, the bullet points patient. My blue folder had never been this loud without making a sound. The supervisor paged through the binder, tabs brushing like the wings of something tired. He stopped at a section labeled verifications and rescans. He pointed to a paragraph about temporary holds for damage, for unpaid fines, for lost items reported. He ran his finger down to see where holidays sat. There was nothing about holidays, nothing about the kind of week the city was having. No allowance for preemptive caution framed as procedure. He looked at me the way a person checks whether you would turn this discovery into fire. I gave him nothing but the same question I had asked from the start. Show me the rule. The attendant reached under the monitor and pulled out a laminated index with key words. He tried holidays. He tried commemorations. He tried crowd control. He tried safety protocol. He shook his head once, a small negative that didn't want to be seen. He tried access. He tried badge overrides. That brought us back to the amber icon we were already staring at, like a person returning to a locked door because he hopes the keyhole changed its mind. Caleb angled his phone so the tiny green check from the entry scan glowed brighter. He wrote, "Door scan confirmed," then the time. He noted that the second activity came after, not before, and that the second activity did not exist in his phone's notifications. He keeps his settings tidy, so if the system wants to talk to him, it does. It had been quiet. My grandson lifted his eyes just once and found mine, and in that moment I felt the sting of how often I'd asked him to make his case with proof, not volume. He had learned. Now the room would have to learn too. The supervisor scrolled. At the bottom of the badge record sat a small field called Notes. It was empty. He tapped into a separate screen and asked the attendant to print a system log. The printer behind the counter woke with a plastic rattle and a breath of warm air sweetened by the smallest hint of ozone. The librarian retrieved the sheet without looking at it and handed it over like a tray she would rather set down on another table. The supervisor read the grid aloud in a voice soft enough to keep it from sounding like a verdict. Time, terminal, user, action. There it was, the door scan, correct. There, too, the checkout station log entry with the word applied next to override. The user code field was masked with dots. The system asked for supervisor credentials to reveal it. The supervisor's finger paused above the key, then landed. The system asked for a reason. He selected review. The system asked again for confirmation. He clicked yes and swallowed, throat moving the way a person does when he realizes his next breath might be witnessed.
He began reading the policy text from the binder alongside what the screen provided. If a badge is to be held, a specific cause must be recorded: damage, fine, or risk listing. The line stayed short, with no footnote that stretched the rule into something it didn't mean. He turned a page and hit a section on student protections, transparency and restrictions, timely explanation, documented path to resolution. The words were maddening in their quiet decency. They were also bones you could hang a body on. He placed a sticky flag on the page and glanced toward the acrylic counter, where the badge still lay like a trapped reflection. I felt the room shrink the way rooms do when a child is waiting to hear the outcome of a measurement. The clock ticked the kind of tick you can only hear when you don't want to count. The vent hummed. The monitor's fan whirred a tone that rose and fell like a machine reminding you it is alive. From somewhere in the stacks came the faint brush of a page turning. The binder's edges had absorbed the smell of years. It lifted when a breeze from the vent touched it. I made a small shelter with my hands on the table's edge and kept breathing. The librarian appeared at the end of the table, not closer than the policy allowed. She kept her hands folded, the knuckles pale. Her eyes tracked the supervisor's. The attendant placed a second laminated card on the table, this one a flowchart with bright arrows guiding decision points. The arrows bent around words like missing item and damage reported and student appeal. None of the arrows began with a day on the calendar. My grandson's foot tapped once against the chair leg and then stilled. The supervisor took up a pen and wrote the date in the top corner of the policy photocopy, then wrote our time of arrival and the time the override appeared. He drew a line between them as if connecting two towns on a small map. He asked for the teacher's authorization and laid it next to the policy. He asked for the reading list and the study plan and touched them like a person counting the beats of a patient's pulse. He didn't pick up the listening circle outline. He stared at it and let it stare back, and I felt a small ache because my wife would have smiled at how plainly it said what it meant. A cluster of posted notices crowded the wall above the table. Quiet zones, phone use, food not permitted, photo release policy, disability access. The fonts didn't match. Some lilted, some shouted. The thin strip of corkboard between them held 3 pushpins with no paper, a tired constellation. I knew those notices were meant to make the room fair. Today they made the room feel officious. My grandson shifted, and I caught a glimpse of the small scar on his wrist when he tried to fix a window screen last summer, and the frame snapped back. He had learned to replace the spline. He had learned to work gently with things that resist. The supervisor moved the mouse to a tab labeled Audit. The software asked for a deeper credential. He typed and paused. The cursor spun like a tiny wind-up toy and then revealed a column with 4 fields: time, station, action, user. The last field still hid behind symbols, but the reveal button waited. He rubbed his temple with 2 fingers and exhaled quietly, the sound of a person pulling up a memory of training while sitting inside its test. I named the smell in the room to keep my thoughts steady: paper, plastic, bleach, dust. I named the textures: cold acrylic, warm monitor, soft edge of cardboard against skin. I named the sounds: vent hum, clock tick, people passing the threshold. I named the weight in my hands: a folder, a plan, a boy's small proof that he had entered through a door the system now pretended he had not. I set the entry log a hair's breadth closer to the supervisor's sleeve, not to crowd him, only to make a quiet bridge he would feel when he reached.
Caleb lifted his phone and took a close photo of the screen with the timestamp in the corner. The reflection of the fluorescent bars made him adjust until they slid off the glass. He saved the image and wrote, "Captured log prompt, awaiting user reveal." He did not smile. He did not frown. He breathed, and I borrowed his steadiness again, the way I used to borrow his grandmother's when paperwork tried to make a person smaller than his name.
The supervisor touched the reveal button. The system hesitated as if it wanted to teach us patience, and then let go, and the masked field resolved into letters that formed a code the three of them recognized before I did. I knew the moment the code resolved that the air around our table had changed. The supervisor's pupils tightened, then softened, the quick contraction of someone who recognizes a thing he hoped would be random. The librarian shifted a weight, and the acrylic divider whispered on its track. The attendant's hand hovered over the mouse like a moth that can't decide whether light is safety or a trap. The field on the screen didn't show a name, just a pattern of letters and numbers that belonged to a staff badge. The room, already small, found a way to narrow. He cleared his throat, the sound as dry as paper, and asked that we relocate to the open space by the counter for transparency. He chose that word the way some people choose a key in a complicated lock. I gathered the blue folder and felt its spine pressing to my palm. The table released us, and our chairs scraped a quiet complaint across the floor. The supervisor picked up the binder, and the attendant grabbed the laminated flowchart and the printout of the log, the paper still warm from the machine. The librarian stayed behind her counter, one hand steady near the acrylic's edge, eyes following the movement with a calm that felt colder than cold. We stepped into the bright square of the lobby, where light pooled from the high windows, and the clock hung like a permanent witness. The smell of lemon cleaner was sharper here, braided with the faint iron scent of toner and the sweetness of a child's shampoo drifting from the story corner. The floor creaked where two tiles didn't sit perfect, a soft click fret under the pressure of footsteps. I set the blue folder on a waist-high table, a platform used for displays and sign-ups, and fanned out the documents in order: entry log, authorization, reading list, study plan, the outline for the listening circle that my wife would have smoothed with the side of her hand. I inhaled once, slow, and let the world stack itself into objects I could count. People glanced without stopping. A parent with a toddler adjusted a strap and kept moving. A pair of teens pretended to study a flyer about SAT dates and turned their heads a fraction at the sound of the printer waking up again. The supervisor angled the monitor so the screen could be seen from the floor. He adjusted the stand until the glare from the overhead fluorescent slid away. The amber icon blinked, deliberate as a heartbeat. The printout listed times and terminals in a grid that laid the motion of our afternoon into a series of squares. The librarian crossed her arms, then uncrossed them, fingertips tapping a rhythm against the counter that matched the clock without meaning to. My grandson stood at my left shoulder. I felt the heat of him the way you feel the sun through glass. He had already opened his notes page and stamped the new time, then typed in one line: "Move to lobby for public review." He tilted his phone and snapped a photo of the monitor, with the angle slightly off to keep the reflection of the light bars from slicing across the evidence. He wrote "glare reduced" and saved it. His steadiness was a plank across water. I put my hand on the blue folder, as if to show the plank could hold two sets of weights at once. The supervisor opened the binder to the policy on holds and read aloud. His voice was not theatrical, not scolding. It carried the way a tuned instrument carries in a room made for listening. If a badge is held, the cause must be recorded. If a cause is recorded, the student must be told. If a hold is applied, the path to remove it must be documented in words anybody can read. He placed his finger on the sentence about documented cause and stayed there a second longer than necessary, as if pressure could transfer from body to page.
The attendant flipped the laminated flowchart so its arrows faced out. Green for return to access, yellow for pause pending cause, red for confirm restriction with written notice. The arrow for holidays did not exist. The arrow for commemorations did not exist. The chart was built like a bridge over water that pretended not to have currents. The supervisor looked to the librarian, and for the first time since she said
internal procedure, something like uncertainty crossed her mouth. All the while, the badge still lay under the acrylic, its small face dimmed by the counter's fogged plastic. I could smell the wipe someone had used earlier to clean the surface, a chemical lemon that never quite conquers the old library smell of paper backbones and glue. I thought of my wife's way of anchoring a room with quiet rituals, straightening a picture so its horizon matched the real one, placing a coaster under a glass to teach wood respect, smoothing the corner of a folded sheet so sleep knew where to begin. I wanted that ritual now, the way hands are sometimes more persuasive than any letter. The supervisor printed a preliminary report. The machine hummed, sighed, then clicked like a small door inside it closed. The first page slid out and bent over the tray lip, warm and damp in the way new ink carries its own breath. The report had fields for reason, staff initials, time of hold, time of review. He set it on the table beside my folder and reached for a pen. The reason field stayed blank. He moved to the policy and laid it open next to the grid of the log, the visual of words and numbers, a study in how institutions try to prevent themselves from becoming feelings. The crowd that wasn't a crowd collected without meaning to be one. Students with earbuds paused their music at one ear. A man with a cane found a bench and made himself part of the hall's furniture, as if sitting were the way to vote his interests. I heard a cot's wheels thrum across a seam in the floor and then stop. The library, which teaches quiet as a kind of strength, gave us a quiet full of attention. That kind of quiet has a weight. It presses until it asks for truth. The attendant lifted a smaller manual, thin and ring-bound, something newer than the binder. It contained internal notes on software changes and checkout procedures. He thumbed to a page labeled Quality of Service Checks and blinked at the absence where a subsection might have been. He set the manual down and picked up the printout again, eyes tracing down to the override line with a care that read his fear of misreading. His jaw worked once, twice, the memory of gum with no gum. He slid the paper toward the supervisor, an offering that said, "I cannot carry this alone." Caleb wrote in his notes, policy read, reason field blank. He scanned the preliminary report with his phone and saved it to a folder named with today's date. He added a new line, librarian moved hands away from acrylic. I looked up and saw that she had indeed stepped back half a pace, an inch of space that felt like 10. My boy doesn't dramatize, he names. It keeps a man from drowning in impressions. The supervisor rubbed a mark on the table with his thumb, the small circle of friction, a thinking motion. He leaned into the monitor and clicked a button that called up a template for student notice. The template stared back, a gray skeletal letter waiting for bones. He hesitated at the field for cause. The cursor blinked its metronome at him. Now, now, now. He looked at the binder, then at the flowchart, then at the manual, and each time returned to the same blank. I thought of a lesson my wife used to give to her third graders when something confusing happened during a fire drill. She would say that a drill without a map is noise, and a map without a drill is a drawing. You need both to teach a body how to move in a crisis. Here, we had a map, we had a drill. What we did not have was permission to pretend that a holiday could play the part of a hazard in a system not designed for that theater.
The supervisor asked the attendant to print the full activity log with user codes visible. The attendant typed a command, and the printer unspooled a longer sheet that stuttered on its way out. The codes appeared in a column that was not masked this time. He laid that paper next to my blue folder, just far enough from the acrylic that anyone could see the way the lines met like rails.
The librarian's gaze moved the way a swimmer's head moves when learning to breathe, rotation without panic. I could not tell if she wanted to back away or step forward. The floor felt less steady under me, the way floors do when a song you used to dance to is played too slow. The clock ticked louder, a phantom amplification. The air from the vent cooled the sweat along my wrist where the folder's edge had pressed for too long. My grandson adjusted his chair by an inch so his shoulder touched mine, a reminder that human warmth is not theory. He typed one more line, waiting on reason or release. The supervisor lifted the pen with a resolve that looked like decision but felt like duty. He wrote a sentence in the notes field. Policy review initiated in open area. Cause not yet identified. He initialed it and dated it, the nib making a soft scratch that cooled my chest. He reached for the notice template again and let his finger hover over the cause field as if, by not touching, he could stop the clock. He took a breath and said that given the circumstances, the best practice would be to read the governing clause aloud where we stood and cross-check it against the log. Then consult the consistency guide in the binder's appendix. He looked around to confirm nobody would call that theater. No one did. The attendant started to print the consistency page. The printer rolled a sheet forward and then shuddered. A light blinked red. Paper jam. The sound it made was the sound of a throat risking a cough in a quiet church. The attendant opened the machine's side panel. Warm, damp air flowed out smelling like hot dust and plastic. He teased out a page with a corner wrinkled into an arrow, then closed the panel and tried again. The machine blinked amber now, undecided between readiness and sulk. The supervisor tapped the side of the binder with 2 fingers and found the appendix by hand, flipping to the page with the speed that came from habit. He laid it open on the table next to my blue folder, so the bold-faced clause on holds sat under the light like a headline. The line said what it said. It did not say what we were living. The librarian shifted behind the counter. She pressed her lips and then let them go, a small furl and release. I could read the choice forming in her shoulders, and I hated that a room had taught me how to read people like that. The supervisor squared his posture and looked at me as if to ask whether we would keep this on paper or allow it to shrink to a private apology. I raised my chin just enough to answer. The air held its breath along with us. The badge glinted dully under acrylic, a trapped star. The supervisor lifted the policy to chest height, ready to read, and the printer beeped once, low and uncertain, like a machine asking for permission to speak. If this is reaching you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and send it to a friend who cares. The printer's uncertain beat folded into the room's quiet, and the supervisor lifted the policy to read with the steadiness of someone placing a beam across 2 posts. The fluorescent bars hummed above us. The acrylic divider whispered as the librarian let it rest still. The faint breath of the air vent cooled the edge of my cheek. He read the clause on holds as if tuning it to the air. Explicit cause, clear notice, documented path to resolution. The words did not reach for more than they meant. They landed in the space between the amber icon and my blue folder, and I felt the sound of them settle like sand finding its level in a jar.
He laid the policy on the table next to the printout, and the 2 documents looked like a pair of hands that did not want to argue. The attendant, relieved to be back in the realm of objects he could touch, turned the laminated flowchart so the arrows pointed outward and traced the route that matched what we were living. Pause, pending cause. No step for holiday, no step for mood, no step for rumor. The librarian's shoulders let go of an inch of tightness, and in that small release I could hear the human cost of holding a line with no words under it. The estagiaria arrived with a thin binder I hadn't seen before, the one with color-coded tabs for internal quality checks. She had the look of someone who had walked quickly but not run, and a faint trace of cold air came with her from the back hallway. She set the binder to the side and opened it to a page that listed response times for student inquiries and expectations for transparency in access decisions. The layout was plain, almost kind, with margins wide enough to breathe. She placed a finger on the sentence about on-the-spot clarification when a hold is applied. By bringing that sentence forward, she closed a small loop that had been opening and opening since the first minute at the counter. The teacher stepped into the lobby soon after, drawn by the quiet concentration that had gathered. She carried the same folder she uses for class projects, its edges worn into a soft slope by years of being lifted and set down. She moved into the space without forcing it to notice her, and stood where the policy and the log could be seen together. The authorization she had given us earlier took on a firmer color on the table beside the policy, like fabric underlined with interfacing. She confirmed in calm tones that the study plan had been approved and that the afternoon was meant to be a reading period, not a negotiation with a machine. Her presence did something the documents alone could not. It handed the afternoon its original shape again and reminded the room what the room was for. The supervisor began a preliminary report, writing with a pen that left an even line on the form's matte surface. He noted time of arrival, time of hold, time of review, and he wrote in a hand that legibility could rely on. He filled the field where cause would go with a line and an arrow pointing back to the policy page, a visual tether that said the decision could not travel alone. This quiet move began to close another loop, the one that ensures a room remembers itself when heat tries to lift it off its nails. My grandson stayed beside me, his phone an instrument, not a shield. He documented each step with a care that made the record feel like a companion rather than a threat. He saved the photo of the policy page, captured the report as it took shape line by line, added a note when the estagiaria placed the internal checks binder on the table. He was the counterweight to all the soft humiliations that had layered themselves on us, the acrylic barrier, the badge trapped under it, the manufactured opacity of a single amber icon. His breath stayed even, and I let that steadiness distribute through my ribs until the urge to brace became a grounded stance instead. The librarian adjusted the acrylic a few inches and then stepped back in a way that acknowledged the table as the current center. Her eyes moved from the policy to the log, then to the flowchart, and each pass softened a little, as if the triangle of those three objects let her see what her day had turned into. She reached for a thin stack of notice forms and laid them near the supervisor's report, a gesture that admitted the process belongs on paper, not in the air. The badge remained where it was, a small square of our afternoon held under a square of someone else's precaution, and that image kept me inside the moment without tipping me into anger.
The supervisor requested a brief check against the consistency guide in the policy appendix. The attendant, eager to be useful in a way that did not require guessing, found the page and spread it next to the flowchart. The appendix offered examples and counterexamples, and the weight of them pressed against the idea that weeks with strong feelings require new locks on old doors. He underlined a phrase about erring on the side of student access when documentation is complete and no rule articulates a restriction. The pen's nib scratched a sound so soft only those of us within arm's reach could hear it, but that sound opened a path. It meant the room had started drawing itself a map. A small circle formed at a respectful distance, a parent with a toddler, a pair of students with their backpacks hugged to their chests, the custodian leaning on his cart with one hand, a man with tired eyes who sat straighter when the policy was read aloud again. This circle didn't clap or murmur or turn the moment into theater. It did what circles do when they are right, held the space without filling it. The library's quiet felt like a choice rather than an absence, and I allowed my breath to match its rhythm. The smell of paper and cleaner layered without competing. The printer, now patient, rested. The supervisor made a phone call that stayed within the lines of the policy, the kind of call that announces a review is happening and invites the presence of the person responsible for student engagement. His voice remained even, and though I could not hear the other end, the light tension in the tendons of his throat told me the message had been received. He noted the call in the margin of his report, wrote the time, drew a small box around it, and signed his initials. By doing so, he closed another small circle, the one that says a review is not an idea, it is an act. The teacher leaned closer to the table and reviewed the listening circle outline I had kept at the bottom of the stack. Her eyes tracked the simple structure we had designed: time for speaking, time for listening, a place for commitments, a space for memory that did not ask one story to consume another. She tapped the portion that referenced the week's context and nodded in a way that made me feel the floor under us again. The outline, which had felt like a hopeful piece of paper hours earlier, acquired the sturdiness of a plan fit for a hallway bulletin board, for a classroom wall, for a schedule by the office door. Without saying a word, she anchored the subplot that had walked beside us since the first minute: study as a form of respect, not a code for avoidance. The estagiaria checked the internal binders section on communication and pointed to a line about displaying a plain language summary of the access policy in high-traffic areas. She set a sticky flag there and tore a small square from a notepad to write a to-do for later about drafting that summary. It was a simple act, the kind you could miss if your eyes hunted only for finales, but I knew its worth. My wife used to say that if you want a house to stand through a storm, you strengthen the small joists, not just the main beam. The sticky flag was a joist, the to-do was another. The attendant, who had spent an hour suspended between procedure and habit, took a copy of the preliminary report and placed it on a clipboard. He wrote a note requesting a quick run of the software's audit function to confirm whether similar holds had been applied without cause in recent weeks. He tucked the clipboard under his arm with the same care my grandson used when saving a file. That tuck closed yet another thread that had begun to fray in the first minutes: whether the room could learn from itself instead of insisting it never airs. My grandson added to his notes a line that surprised me with its modesty: student presence observed, process read aloud, documents aligned. He created a new folder labeled with the date and the school name, and moved the day's photos and captures into it. He placed the phone face down for a beat and let his palms rest on his knees. His stillness was not exhaustion, it was readiness. It told me he understood that dignity often takes the shape of a pause before the next correct step.
The supervisor rechecked the policy page and sighed in a way that released pressure without surrender. He placed the report, the flow chart, the appendix page, and the teacher's authorization in a neat stack oriented toward the counter. He looked at the badge under acrylic and then at the printer, as if negotiating trust with two different machines. He picked up the policy again, straightened its top edge with his thumb, and returned it to the exact spot where anyone could read it. The tidy return of that page felt like a promise that would soon be asked to keep itself. I felt the weight shift in my chest from tight wire to braided rope. It was still a pull, but now it had give.
The library returned to its sounds, page turns, shoe scuffs, the small squeak of a cart's wheel needing oil. The lemon cleaner scent receded into something like a background instrument. The clock resumed being a clock. The light through the high windows found a calmer temperature. I kept my hand on the blue folder, the cardboard warm from my skin, the papers inside aligned to match the policy's language. Cause, notice, path to resolution. The subplots we had carried with us began to quiet in their places. The internal checks had been opened and read. The teacher's authorization had been given its proper weight. The outline for the listening circle had stepped from idea to plan. The policy had been read aloud in a room that chose to listen. A note had been made to explain that policy where eyes naturally travel. Nothing had been concluded. Everything had been prepared. When the supervisor capped his pen and straightened the report, the sound was small but meaningful. The closing click of a case not yet decided but ready to be judged by its own rules. I drew a breath that reached the bottom of my lungs. The badge still waited under acrylic, the table held the map, and the room at last felt capable of walking it. The room held the quiet a second longer, and then the supervisor began to read. He raised the policy to chest height and gave the clause back to the air in a voice that didn't ask permission to be believed. Explicit cause, clear notice, documented path to resolution. He lowered the page to the table and with the other hand pointed to the log printout where the override sat like a fingerprint in fresh dust. He read the time of entry, the station, the user field, the action. He did not press his voice against anyone. He let the words do their own carrying. The amber icon on the monitor blinked once more and then stilled as if it had realized it had been invited to a meeting where it was not the guest of honor. He asked the attendant to open the audit view again and stepped closer to the counter, the corner of his report brushing my blue folder. He rested the tip of his pen on the reason field and said that because no valid cause had been recorded, the system's hold could not stand. His pen lifted. He made a small mark, the kind of mark that frees bigger things. Then he turned toward the acrylic and nodded to the librarian. The gesture traveled through the space with a weight that did not require volume. I smelled lemon cleaner and old book glue and the faint iron of toner, and the scents layered without fighting, like instruments reaching their chord. The librarian's hand hovered at the acrylic's edge. For the first time, the room felt the tremor of her choice. She slid the divider back along its track until the gap was wide enough for a human exchange. The tray opened. The badge lay there face down, the plastic warm from the bulbs beneath the counter. She paused, then flipped it over so the photo met the light and the name was readable by anyone standing close enough to care. She did not speak. The supervisor spoke for the room instead. He said the badge would be returned immediately, the record corrected, and an internal report filed to ensure the practice did not repeat itself under another name on another day.
He called the policy's clause again, not to scold, but to anchor. He wrote a sentence on the form: cause not established, hold removed, access restored. His initials followed, tight and square. He passed the pen to the attendant, who signed in careful letters that looked like they had been taught on lined paper. The librarian accepted the pen last. Her name landed in the same ink as ours, and something in the tension of her shoulders loosened without disappearing. The consequence had found its shape, accountability that did not make a spectacle of a person, but insisted the institution be seen. The supervisor then set out the next steps. Training would be scheduled for the service desk staff on the access policy and the software's override function. A plain language summary of the policy would be posted at the counter and in the lobby. The audit feature would be run for the last month to identify any similar holds. A standing practice would begin of reading the governing clause aloud when a hold is applied in front of a student. He wrote each line on the report as he spoke it, the nib whispering across the paper. None of it sounded like punishment for its own sake. All of it sounded like repair. He lifted the acrylic fully now, the way you lift a gate for a neighbor you've kept waiting too long. He took the badge between his fingers and held it up long enough for us to notice that it was just a square of plastic that could never bear what it had been asked to carry. He placed it in my grandson's hand, palm to palm, and the heat of it jumped into our skin. The scanner at the edge of the counter beeped a single bright note when my boy slid the badge across it, and the green confirmation glowed with the calm of a small, correct sunrise. The sound ran its gentle line through the lobby and slackened a cord I hadn't realized had wrapped around my ribs. The teacher stepped forward to document the return on her copy of the authorization, the way some people mark bedside charts when a fever breaks. She checked the time and wrote the note in the margin. Access restored, study period resumes. The estagiaria flagged the binder again at the communications section and wrote out a draft sentence for the policy summary in words that made sense to a teenager at a counter. What you need, what we must tell you, what we will do. The attendant lifted the preliminary report from the table and clipped it to a board labeled Today, the springs bite clicking shut with a finality that didn't bruise. The librarian stood very still and then found the thing she could do. She reached for the stack of student notices and pulled out one that was blank. She set it on the counter and wrote, "Hold removed. No cause recorded, staff corrective action initiated." She dated it. She slid it to the edge of the counter so anyone could read it, so the record would not be trapped on a screen. She didn't look at me when she did it. She didn't need to. The act was the yes where a no had squatted. The supervisor returned to the binder and the flowchart and turned them so their printed faces greeted the room. He announced in the plainness a library deserves that the listening circle outline we had brought would move forward for scheduling with student engagement, and that the mural plan would be reviewed by the teacher and the principal for placement where the hallway breathes. He didn't promise more than a person can promise on a weekday afternoon, but he promised enough that the school would make a place for memory to share its chair without knocking another story to the floor. Consequences settled in their proper seats. The librarian would complete refresher training and participate in a brief review with her supervisor. The staff would post the summary and run the audit. The counter would keep a copy of the clause within arm's reach. None of it made our afternoon vanish. All of it made the next afternoon less likely to repeat ours. The room took a breath that sounded like a page turning where the corner doesn't tear.
My grandson stood a little taller without making a show of it. He saved his photos and his notes to a folder named for the date and the policy clause, then locked his phone and slid it into his pocket. He didn't grin. He didn't drop his gaze. He looked at the shelf where the books we had come to borrow still waited. The teacher nodded toward that shelf, and the motion moved us forward the way a hand on a shoulder can feel like permission and invitation at once. I placed my hand on the blue folder and felt the cardboard soften edge as if it were a hand I used to hold. I heard my wife and the small good sound of the scanner's beep and the scratch of the pen as a policy found its voice in a way a crowd can choose not to be a mob, but a circle. I felt the cool along the acrylic's track where we had stood too long. The light from the high windows had found its late afternoon tone, and it painted the floor with rectangles that looked like open doors. The supervisor closed his pen and set it beside the report. The attendant wiped the counter with a rag and did not hurry. The cloth's damp tracing a rectangle where an hour had pressed its shape into laminate. The stagiaria gathered the flag pages with a care that read as respectful rather than timid. The librarian held herself on her feet and let her breath settle to a pattern that did not count down. We moved to the shelf. We found the book with the call number written in pencil on our list. We held it, the quiet weight of a thing the room had asked us to doubt. The checkout station waited without drama. The badge met the scanner, and the system cleared our place in line. Paper slid from the printer. Due date, title, barcode. The edges curled as they cooled. My grandson tucked the slip into the book like a promise you make to a future self. The librarian met my eyes for the first time and nodded once, a small acknowledgement that didn't undo anything and didn't pretend to. I took a breath from the bottom of my lungs and felt it rise without catching. The library had returned to what a library is, a place where the rules keep the door open, not shut. The policy lay open on the table for anyone to read. The report waited for the next signatures in the audit. The outline for the listening circle sat in the blue folder, ready to be carried into a room that could hold more than one truth at a time. The afternoon, which had been pulled out of shape, let itself be smoothed. We stepped back into the lobby light. The clock kept its patient count. The air smelled like paper and lemon and the faint sweetness children bring with them from home. My grandson pressed the book to his chest the way people hold something they plan to learn from rather than prove with. I laid my palm on the blue folder and felt the warm spot where my hand had been. When a rule remembers its purpose, a door remembers how to open. If you stayed to the end, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me what you'd do, especially if it were your family. Until next time,